Buenos días y bienvenidos a ustedes a esta sesión de la conferencia BioLogos en 2019. If you understood 51% or more of what I just said, raise your hand. Óyeme, mi hermanos y hermanas. You know, speaking, claro que sí. Well, you know, speaking in a foreign language can be distancing or welcoming, depending upon your perspective. And I remember about 10 years ago, my first encounter with BioLogos was, for me, incredibly welcoming. It created a language of sorts that I needed, but I didn't really realize how much I needed it as an educator. But it was distancing to some of my colleagues who felt that some of that language was pushing them away in some form or fashion. What I realized from BioLogos was that this intersection between faith and science, which is a dangerous one, doesn't always require a stop sign. As a matter of fact, almost never does. But instead a yield sign. One of the beautiful things about BioLogos that I've learned is this yielding, winsome nature with which they approach these difficult questions. My name is Carlos Campo, or for some of you, Carlos Campo. I have the privilege of serving at Ashland University, where part of my job, as a matter of fact, one of the great privileges of serving as a university president is to try to help to form this culture, this campus culture that should be fostering of the kaleidoscopic power of wisdom and knowledge and wonder and all the things that we believe in. But very often we're hearing that there's a binary sense of truth and a curated sense of truth. And I'm hearing from others that, Carlos, this is the first time in U.S. history where we feel like our students are being inculcated and not educated. Well, we believe that if we're going to get beyond conflict and have fuller discussions that rely on our determination that there is a better way forward, we have to stop being imperialists of all sorts, as Justo encouraged us to be, and to understand better what science is all about and what its limitations are. And when we confront imperialists from any side, how do we engage in those conversations with greater winsomeness, with more yield signs, so that we can be like I was when I first encountered BioLogos, somewhat like John Keats, when he first just read a translation of Homer by a man named Chapman, and he felt as though a new planet had swum into his ken. Well, no pressure on our next speaker, but that's exactly what Dr. Tim O'Connor is going to help us with. Dr. O'Connor has taught philosophy at Indiana University Bloomington since 1993, apart from year-long research fellowships at both the University of Notre Dame and St. Andrews. He's given over 160 academic and popular lectures in 22 countries. His main areas of scholarship and teaching are metaphysics, philosophy of the mind, philosophy of religion. He has published over 70 scholarly articles and edited 7 books, written 2 monographs, one on free will and the other on God and the quest for ultimate explanation. He is now writing a 3rd book for a broader audience. It's entitled Thinking About Faith, Philosophy, Science, and Christian Belief. On his website, he makes this startling claim that he is the Philo Pong World Grand Champion. That is a little-known title, but it means he is the greatest living professional ping pong player who is also a philosopher. And I'm sure that many people want to, yeah. You know what, folks? Titles are scarce in this group, and so we're gonna say we'll challenge him. We'll challenge him for too long. Help me welcome Dr. Tim O'Connor. Tim.
Well, I'll tell you, after last night and this morning, I was given some tough acts to follow. Jim Stump, where are you, Jim? He's off over there. I'll do my best not to let humble team philosophy down. All right. Well, it can only seem a great irony to most people today. Systematic experimental study of the natural world was largely an outgrowth of Christian theology. Excuse me there. Educated Christians in the new universities of the late Middle Ages and on into the early 16th and 17th centuries had this starting conviction that the world must have an intelligible order, since it was the product of an infinitely wise God. At the same time, they didn't think that one could deduce its nature by pure reasoning. as God was free to create any of an infinite set of possible worlds. And we are, of course, in no position to deduce the mind of God. The only thing to do then was to observe what he has done and then look to systematize what was observed in statements of natural law that reveal its elegant order. Times changed. Agnosticism and atheism became a thing, and some declared that the child of science had cast off or even murdered the parent of theology. It's not that anyone ever thought that science could only be done by people accepting certain theological starting points. The change was that some became persuaded that science rendered theology obsolete, unnecessary, or worse, positively contradicted it. We see many expressions today of the view that science and theology are rivals or combatants. This view became widespread only in the late 19th century. So, Andrew Dixon White, who was a historian and the first president of Cornell University, wrote of there being a conflict between two epochs in the evolution of human thought, the theological and the scientific. Again from White, this time more strongly. It is a war continued longer, with battles fiercer, with sieges more persistent, with strategy more vigorous than in any of the comparatively petty warfares of Alexander or Caesar or Napoleon. Another 19th century historian, John William Draper, wrote that the history of science is the narrative of the conflict of two contending powers. And he went on to say that the mortal animosity of the church towards science has left its hands steeped in blood. Together, White and Draper helped shape modern perceptions in a way that would be completely unrecognizable to people of earlier eras. Now, science is in the business of describing and explaining natural phenomena, most often by discerning general patterns, then positing mechanisms and principles that are responsible for those patterns, with new data spurring theory development or better theories in an endless loop. If there is a deep conflict between science and Christian theology, then, it would have to be because theology offers competing explanations to the entrenched consensus explanations of science. We should be mindful that much of Christian theology is not at all about giving explanations, but some of it is. To say that God is the source and sustainer of all else, including ourselves, and that we have a supernatural destiny, implies that there are true theological explanations. The created order exists because God intended it for certain ends, and we humans have a distinctive, nature-transcending end that we ought to pursue. It is, of course, possible, and historically has sometimes been the case, that Christians and our critics understand the explanatory claim that God is the creator of the universe and of ourselves in a way that does compete with ordinary scientific theorizing in cosmology and biology. Much of this conference will consist of Christian thinkers, scientists and theologians both, trying to persuade you to think again on that score. We should not be afraid to acknowledge that Christian theological understanding of God's creative activity has changed, dare I say, evolved over time. This is not theological unfaithfulness. It's simply good communal thinking and learning. And it's been going on a very long time. We see it in the 5th century reflections of St. Augustine on the screen, whom no one, I think, would accuse of accommodating to the spirit of the age. This morning, I want to address the claim of some in our day that conflict between theology and science cannot be avoided. no matter how we understand the claims of divine creation and purpose, since whatever, on their view, whatever can be explained by science alone. A little reflection shows that this claim, even though it's sometimes made by highly intelligent, trained people, it's certainly mistaken. Here, the perception of conflict is not bad theology, but a bad understanding of science. It is the result of a totalizing vision of science, a science without any intrinsic explanatory limits. This distorted understanding is often called scientism. We all make mistakes, but scientism is not just one of those things. It is harmful in important ways. Christians see harm in a view that denies the possibility of the truth of the Christian gospel and the explanatory claims that this entails. Less obviously, though, it is also potentially harmful to the practice of science itself. And some secular scientists have come to see the danger and are beginning to speak and write about it. We should approach those scientists with open hands as potential allies. Together, we can celebrate this tremendous collective, now global achievement that is science, while recognizing that it is a human achievement, fallible, provisional, and limited in scope. But we Christians can promote such a balanced perspective on science only if we ourselves do not overreact by embracing an opposite extreme, which I'll call fideism, that denies that science can provide good, approximately true, faith-neutral explanations that in some cases even force us to rethink familiar ways of framing our own theological commitments. We don't have a catchy word for the stance that lies between scientism and fideism. No doubt the Germans do, but I don't speak German. I'd rather not coin a new ism, which would suggest yet another ideology. Personally, I think of it as sweet reasonableness, but you might accuse me of stacking the deck if I use that term. So I suggest we reclaim old St. Anselm's phrase of faith seeking understanding. To see what this Anselmian stance amounts to and how it stands apart from both scientism and fideism, we need to think in big picture terms about the nature and limits of science, and then also about how God relates to the totality of his creation, such that theological creation explanations complement, without competing with, scientific forms of explanation. Having done so, we'll be able to better engage our secular, science-literate friends and to recognize and to respond to expressions of scientism in a way that affirms the explanatory power and value of science for all of us. As I noted, what unifies our extremely diverse array of sciences is their common aim of describing and explaining natural phenomena in purely natural terms. The sciences typically look for consistent patterns and principles with occasional focus on key developmental junctures, such as milestones in human biological or cultural evolution and the origin of humanity, life, planets, stars, and the universe itself. We've learned an extraordinary amount in this way. But, as with all things human, science has hard limits, both inner limits and outer limits. Start with the inner limits. Finite beings must start somewhere, with basic assumptions about ourselves as knowers and doers, and about the world that we seek to study. Concerning ourselves, scientists, with the rest of us, must assume that our basic cognitive capacities are generally reliable, including our five senses, right, our memory, and our basic methods of abstract reasoning. It's tempting, if you took an introduction to philosophy class, you'd be tempted to say, well, wait a minute. We can show that our cognitive capacities are reliable by pointing out that we all agree about simple cases, right? So we could poll everyone in this room. We all agree, yeah, there's a lot of people in this room sitting around tables and so on. But as skeptical philosophers have pointed out long ago, this attempt to confirm the reliability of the senses is circular, bad circular reasoning. I can know what you are seeing only if you communicate that to me. And I receive this communication through my senses, the reliability of which was the very thing we were trying to show. The moral is that you are either a complete skeptic, which no one is in reality, or you accept that it is reasonable to start from a foundational trust that we are in effective contact with reality. Our senses and memory are limited and fallible, to be sure. And scientists can study their limits, but we must assume a basic reliability to get that study and the rest of science off the ground. Science is also limited by the fact that we can learn many things by and only by non-scientific methods. So I know that you are sitting in front of me, but not by science. I know that I had Cheerios this morning for breakfast, but not by science. I know about current world events and distant historical events, but not by science. I know that some political and economic systems better enable broad human flourishing than at least some others, but not by science. I know that murdering the innocent is wrong and caring for the needy is good, but again, not by science. There are many things we can know only by science, but there are also things that we can know only by means other than science. Science does not have a monopoly on human knowledge. Indeed, what we learn through science requires us to draw on what we learn by non-scientific means, which indicates that science is not even a wholly autonomous way of knowing. Simple perception, visual perception, other forms of perception, as when a scientist looks at a measuring instrument, and memory, as when she writes down what she took herself to have observed just a few moments ago, are obvious examples of scientific dependence on non-scientific knowledge. Less often noted is that skillfully handling the testimony of other people is a fundamental and pervasive way of knowing for human beings. And it is inescapable within science, too. When you stop and think about it, you'll quickly realize that almost all of what we know comes from what other people tell us. This is obvious in young children, but even as mature, educated adults, we base most of what we know on social sources that gather, sift, organize, and transmit information to us. Think about it. Natural and human history, geography and current affairs, scientific information and theories. It's all rooted for us as individuals in what we're told, whether by word, textbook, or media. Likewise, given the hyper-specialized nature of modern sciences, most of what an individual scientist knows, even in her own area of specialty, is based on what she reads in scholarly journals by other similarly trained scholars, not by what she herself has independently verified. To be sure, trust must be properly measured, not naive, in everyday life and in the structured communities that constitute the sciences. But the point remains that scientific knowing, like nearly all human knowing, is deeply communal and is inescapably rooted in a form of measured interpersonal trust. Science is also constrained by the very general facts that it must presuppose about the world. In seeking deep patterns and principles, it assumes that the natural world is an integral system with an internal coherence to the way that it unfolds. Like the assumption that our senses are basically reliable, This belief is so basic to us that it's easy to overlook. Scientists make a comparatively small number of observations and, in time, through developing theories, project certain patterns that they observe onto the multitude of events that they don't observe. But no amount of observation can rule out that the world is rigged so as to behave one way when we're looking at it and another way when we're not. Another bizarre to us world hypothesis that science does not show to be false, and philosophers like to think about such bizarre possibilities, is that the world popped into existence 5 minutes ago, replete with misleading signs of apparent age, including our own mistaken memories. Scientists don't prove such weird possibilities are false. They, along with us, disregard them. We assume from the outset that they are false, having no other choice. We've seen that the human activity of science is subject to a number of inner limits. It is not and cannot be the sole source of human knowledge, and it must assume things about our basic cognitive tools and the world it seeks to describe using those tools. Science is also subject to important outer limits, defined by certain big or ultimate questions that it cannot seek to answer. Francis Collins alluded to some of these last night. So one of these, perhaps the biggest question of all, is why there is any physical reality at all. However expansive we end up learning that it is, and however far we get in understanding its foundational character. Stephen Hawking, of all people, put the question beautifully well when he asked, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? Another related question is why the physical order that there is exhibits such, the physical reality that there is, exhibits such remarkable and elegant order. And a final set of questions on which science is necessarily silent concern the source of value and whether or not there is any deep purpose to human or other sentient life. It is precisely these kinds of ultimate questions that the Trinitarian, self-incarnating God of Christian faith speaks to. In the Christian tradition, God has long been understood to be, at his core, infinite perfection, from which it follows that he must exist necessarily or from himself, not in dependence on anything else, and to be the transcendent source and immanent sustainer of the cosmos, or cosmoi, if there turn out to be more than one, and everything therein. As the greatest Christian philosopher, Thomas Aquinas, emphasized, part of God's generosity is in giving to his creation its own creative powers. These powers are no less real for being dependent moment by moment on God's giving them being. So, Aquinas suggested, if we look at things from the point of view of a theorist about the natural order, we might think of God as the cause of causes, both their source and, as Husto emphasized, their end. Cause in both sense, the ultimate cause, but the cause of causes. He brings completion to the explanatory framework of science without contesting any of it by explaining the ultimate existence and order of what science studies. Because we respect the integrity of what God has created, we ought not to explain a poorly understood part of creation by supposing it to be miraculously caused wholly by God. As another great Christian thinker, Leibniz, said, miraculous divine intervention is prompted not by the deficiencies of nature, but those of grace. God underlies everything that happens everywhere, and so we oughtn't to imagine him as the God merely of the gaps in what science currently understands about the world. Leibniz made this point while criticizing no less than Isaac Newton, who appealed to God to fill a gap that he thought he saw in his new system of physics. That way of thinking is a hangover from the animistic early days of human history, rather than reflecting a proper grasp on the transcendent monotheism first revealed to the world through the ancient Hebrews. It is the job of various sciences to try to explain the principles that underlie the development of life on Earth, or of the cosmos from its beginning, 13.8 billion years ago, we're told. God, in turn, explains why the cosmos has being and why it has the ingredients necessary to exhibit its deepest patterns, expressible in beautiful equations that make possible the development that we observe in it. Adding to the force of this explanation is the recent discovery of physics, that the foundational order of our universe is exquisitely fine-tuned for the development of life. We could spend a lot of time talking about that, but I don't have such time, so I'll just make that remark. If you're not familiar, there's lots you can read about that. It's quite remarkable what physics has shown about how our universe it has at its foundational level the ingredients and the principles such that if things were ever so slightly different beyond an incredibly tiny range of magnitude, life would not have been possible. Right? It turns out it's very, very hard to have a universe anything like ours in which life emerges. It's remarkable further still that this fine-tuned order of things can be studied and understood by human beings. It's not just a given that that's true. People like us, children of dust, crawling around on the face of a small planet, using the extraordinary tool of mathematics. The agnostic physicist Eugene Wigner was left to marvel at what he called the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics for those doing natural science. It takes effort to notice, as Wigner did, the peculiarity of something that is so familiar to us. Finally, consider that really powerful theories unify areas of knowledge. Think of Newton's physics, that for the first time successfully described the motions of both earthly and heavenly bodies in one system. It unified the cosmos from a physical point of view. Or Darwin's biology, that accounts for the variety and location of species and fossils and the intricate patterns that we see in comparative anatomy and genetics. For the Christian theist, God unifies the realm of impersonal nature with the realities of value and purpose. Nature and value alike flow from his power, governed by his own supremely valuable nature. God naturally seeks the manifestation of his own glory in all that he does. We can get all heady and philosophical, if you have a taste for it, by saying that God is the single unifying fount of the three paramount transcendent categories that Plato first identified a couple thousand years ago: beauty, goodness, and truth. To turn an off-cited comment by Richard Dawkins on its head, Christian theism makes it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled lover of science. Of course, and alas, not everyone sees things in this Anselmian, faith-seeking, understanding way. I'll leave aside the question of how best to engage our friends and colleagues who recognize the limits of science, but decline to embrace God as the way to bring completion to the framework of understanding that science provides us. Instead, let's consider the simpler task of recognizing and constructively engaging scientistic attitudes. Key, I believe, is to sharply distinguish scientific theories which say nothing at all about God or human purpose and significance from the all-encompassing narratives that some noisily attach to those theories. So, Here's a quotation from a very important evolutionary biologist of the 20th century, George Gaylord Simpson. He writes, man is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind. Now, notice how this blurs an unobjectionable scientific claim with it's a sneakily implied metaphysical claim, right? It's true that biology does not have a notion of imminent purpose. It doesn't reference a notion of purpose in understanding how life develops on planet Earth. That's true, right? But it's silent on the question of whether that entire process has a purpose outside of it, given to it by the God who has given being to that very process, right? So, hustos so that, right? Not just the because, right? It's silent on that. Here's another quote from Simpson, who, by the way, was raised as a Christian. He writes, "The Darwinian revolution completed the liberation from superstition and fear that began in the physical sciences a few centuries before. Man, too, is a natural phenomenon." Notice how he announces that with, as if this is really important. There's an implication there, right? Because again, this sentence can be read in two ways. Of course, we are natural. We are parts of the natural world. Who would have denied that, right? So that's not news, right? But he's saying something, he's implying something more. We are merely natural, right? We have no supernatural end or destiny. That's not part of science. That's a scientific expression that's going beyond the science. 2 weeks ago, I was at a big international conference with neuroscientists and philosophers talking about the nature of human volition, the will. Here's a quote from one of the neuroscientists who spoke at that conference. "We are just a pack of neurons, which are just a bunch of circuits." I hasten to add that this speaker was quite a charming fellow. People say they believe all kinds of things. In this case, I think he just believes that he believes it. Okay, you get that? That's a second-order belief, a belief about your own beliefs. It's an important distinction, and it's one that's, I think, implicit in, for example, Jesus' teaching concerning true belief in him, right, necessarily entailing obedience, right? He's alive to the distinction between what do you actually believe and what do you merely believe that you believe. Finally, from the big picture science of cosmology, and since we're currently going through an 80s cultural nostalgia, I give you the granddaddy scientific quote of them all from Carl Sagan: "The cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be." Now, separating scientific theories from these kinds of superimposed narratives is sometimes challenging. It's not always a very easy thing to do because it is undoubtedly the case that certain far-reaching theories do shed light on human nature and on our place within the cosmos. And we should not shy from acknowledging this. I'll give just a few quick examples. So neuroscience and cognitive psychology are helping us to understand cognitive disorder and cognitive flourishing, when our minds are functioning poorly and when our minds are functioning well. Evolutionary theory establishes our kinship with the rest of the animal kingdom, and it gives insight into both the dark side of human nature, aggression, sexual competition, tribalism, and the bright side, which is less often advertised, altruism, forms of familial bonding. And astronomy opens up without yet answering a far-reaching question that's going to be talked about later today. Are there intelligent forms of life beyond the earth? When the Christian story of creation, fall, and redemption is told without any reference to these scientific developments, our science-literate, unbelieving friends are apt to see them as unenlightened, even childish tales. The biggest story of all is made to look small and provincial in their eyes. We ought to do better. The good news is that there is now an abundance of resources that seamlessly weave scientific and theological understanding into a compelling whole, with something for everyone's taste. Intellectual essay or book, if you're like me, autobiography or interview of believing scientists, creative works of literature, poetry, and film, and yes, podcasts. So, when it comes to handling popular narratives surrounding actual science, we need to be discerning. Different sciences are slowly explaining significant aspects of ourselves. But what they don't do is to tell us how we ought to behave and what our ultimate goals ought to be. Evolution helps to explain the impulse to sexual promiscuity. But that doesn't show that I ought to want to produce as many offspring as I can. Neuroscience is starting to explain the chemical differences underlying moods and impulses, ranging from murderous rage to sympathetic identification. But it can't tell me why I should suppress the one and foster the other. In general, when confronted with a tidy science explains it all or explains it all away pronouncement, invite your dialogue partner to slow down and think through what the scientific basis of the claim they're proposing actually is, and consider how her statements may be overreaching that basis. In doing so, we should strive to be non-defensive and unthreatened by the science. Indeed, we ought to share their wonder and delight at what we seem to be learning together as human beings. We should be quick to acknowledge that some scientific results or implications leave us puzzled, given how we have tended to understand certain theological claims, and then to be animated by the possibility of gaining insight on that puzzle as the Christian community ponders it. Above all, we should be people who marry confidence in the broad contours of Christian teaching about our place in God's purposes with humility about how all the pieces fit together. So last night, both Deb Harzma and Pastor Ortberg also emphasized the importance of humility. When an astronomer, a pastor, and a philosopher all think something's important, chances are it's pretty important. We need greater intellectual humility as Christians when we are wrestling with how to think about science. We don't have all the answers right now, and it's okay, right? It's actually quite fun, right? That means there's a lot for us to collectively begin to slowly start learning together. Common to Anselm's Christian charter, faith-seeking understanding, and the best forms of scientific quest is intellectual humility coupled to a deep desire for new knowledge and understanding. And you can be ready to learn something new only if you recognize that there are things you don't know. Don't you think there are things we don't fully understand yet about the infinite God who made us and his ways of doing things? Being humble about the limits of our own understanding, love compels us to be bold in pointing out the ways that scientific narratives harm. In seeking to wield science as a weapon with which to slay rival worldviews, people who espouse scientism can encourage dogmatism about current theories, fostering uncritical attitudes that are the antithesis of scientific inquiry. In failing to deliver the goods when it comes to matters of meaning and purpose, they can foster a morally unhealthy disillusionment. Worst of all, scientism can cause people to choose between bad alternatives. Either embrace the nihilism that scientism ultimately entails, or reject the fundamental human and physical sciences on the faulty grounds that they promote such a dehumanizing view of reality. Nihilism is the denial of objective value, and specifically the deep moral value of human persons, out of which flows the rights that we have as individuals and the responsibilities that we owe to each other. In inferring this ugly and debilitating nihilist doctrine or variants on it, the adherents of scientism are letting their cramped worldview dictate what they allow as evidence, rather than inferring from the full range of evidence to a more adequate worldview. We perceive the world as a place imbued with value, both the positive value of moral goodness and beauty and the negative value of injustice and undeserved suffering. Again, I feel like I'm echoing many themes that have been spoken by previous speakers, but as Pastor Ortberg reminded us to think of our mothers saying to you, we do know some things morally. Science, it is true, cannot measure or explain such value and meaning, as science is limited to the physically detectable and measurable. But that does not give us reason to doubt its reality. It just shows us one of science's many limits. Science can study the mechanisms that facilitate our moral perception. But that is no more debunking of the reality of what we perceive than is scientific understanding of the mechanisms of visual perception. There is a broad lesson here with which I will close. Good theories unify a range of things that we know, but we must resist cheap and easy unification that rests on leaving out stubborn realities that our proposed theories cannot handle. Scientism is guilty of such shortcutting, and so are some deficient varieties of Christian theology that resist integration with our best science. So let us seek to occupy the middle ground, where we will find most of our educated secular friends that fully embraces the diverse panoply of our sciences and promotes their continuing development, while rejecting the unsubstantiated and indeed untenable knowledge imperialism that is scientism. And as we do so from the broader posture of faith seeking understanding, let us pray for the collective insight and wisdom to describe the incomparable beauty of the revelation that God was in Christ, reconciling the world to himself, in a way that integrates it satisfyingly with everything that we humans have come to know through the skillful activity that is science, which itself comes down to us from the giver of every good gift. Thank you.
All right, so sorry to curtail your ongoing discussions. I'm sure they were rich, but you've also asked questions, and we have the answerer. He is seated to my right, so we're going to lean on Dr. O'Connor to answer your questions. That's right. So we are going to begin with the most popular question. Here it is, Tim. You ready for this? Folks, are we ready for this? If you are talking with someone who assumes scientism, what's a good way to start a conversation, and how can we help them see the limits of science in a gracious way?
Wow.
Started with a softball. That's wasn't my question, but there it is.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine it would go a little bit different depending on the personality of the individual involved. There's a certain kind of aggressive scientific kind of attitude, and that might be one thing. But maybe someone who is not quite presenting in that way, but nevertheless are sort of persuaded quietly that science has all the answers, is just to get them to reflect on how they go about their daily life when they're not engaging in intellectual debate. I wanted to say we need to distinguish between what people believe and what they believe that they believe. And I think most people, because we are spiritual beings, we are created by God with a desire for him, whether we know it or not, and a capacity for relationship. And so we all have that, and you can't eradicate that from us. And so just trying to, I think that's a good starting point, is just tell me about your life, your relationships, and get people to reflect on that, and what's implicit in the very way they live their lives, in the relationships that they have, and to draw out of that things they think they know, the things that they believe quite deeply, and kind of point out none of this has anything much to do with science per se. So I think that's a good starting point, to disarm them.
Great. And how did you cue the piano at that time?
Yes.
That was amazing.
Time's up.
Guy's
Okay.
unbelievable. All right. How about this one? How would you answer humanists whose narrative on the history of philosophy and science is that they began before Christianity in the West, ancient Greece, and was hijacked by the church rather than humanism hijacking them from Christianity?
Yeah. I mean, that's just false history. That's what has to be communicated. I mean, sure, human attempts to think scientifically in explanatory terms about the world around us predates Christianity in ancient Greece. I love ancient Greek philosophy, right? All the way up until, say, the late 17th, 18th century, science and philosophy were just this one thing called natural philosophy, or at least the theoretical side of philosophy. It was people who were both philosophers and scientists, and they hadn't really learned how to disentangle purely empirical questions from what we now think of as the more philosophical questions. So that's part of my intellectual heritage as a philosopher, and I love and esteem that, and so I certainly wouldn't want to downplay that. But I want to say that the learning how to study the world empirically and begin to applying experimental methodology begins in the Middle Ages. It's before what we think of as the rise of modern science, and then it really gets going in this late 16th century people, and then 17th century people like Galileo, and the vast majority of these people, because of the culture that they were in, were Christians of one sort or another. That's just an historical fact. And the church promoted the development of science. There's a historian from UC Berkeley who's a historian of the rise of science. He's not himself religious, but he says the Catholic Church was the biggest funder of science, right, well into something like the 18th century, right? The church has been heavily invested in that because out of a theological commitment that God calls us to see in the world around us a reflection of His glory, and so understanding how God has put this world together is a part of that. So I just think it's historically ignorant. There have been flashpoints. Galileo is the first most prominent one. Darwin was another flashpoint. But these flashpoints, there's a lot of mythology surrounding those flashpoints. Don't have time to get into that here. But even recognizing, that was a point where theology sort of saw itself as at odds with certain scientific developments. These are rare episodes in what has been largely a peaceful coexistence and mutually supporting activity.
Tim, thank you. How about this one? Please explain why the fine-tuning of the universe is or isn't just another God of the gaps argument.
Good. Yeah. So the thing about physics seems to indicate that a number of sort of basic parameters that describe, and it's important to say basic. I think that's very important. Fundamental physics. So this is stuff that doesn't get explained by deeper still science. But a number of basic parameters seem like they need to be just so. If you do computer simulated models of the development of the universe, and you say, well, what if we change the strength of this force, to this degree, or what if we altered the basic particle ratio at the very earliest stages of the universe, and we tweaked it in certain ways. In the advent of computers, right, you're actually able to do simulations and see what the large scale evolution would look like. And it turns out that in almost every case, either things fly apart too quickly, and so there's no ability for attractive forces to take hold, and so you just got isolated particles, no interesting chemical molecules, or the attractive forces are too strong, and after an initial expansion, things collapse very quickly. And so you don't get differentiation of interesting structures, and so you can't have life either way. And it turns out in most scenarios you run where you alter these a number of different variables, that's what you get. You get one of those two lifeless possibilities. So that's what the science tells us. Now, physics isn't done yet. So it could turn out, right, that a number of the fine-tuned factors, and in fact it likely will turn out that at least some of the fine-tuned factors can be accounted for in terms of a deeper theory. But it seems to be the judgment, I'm a total outsider to this, no less of a dyed-in-the-wool skeptic atheist than Richard Feynman said near the end of his life. He judged it very unlikely that you're going to see all this fine-tuning, these factors going away in terms of some simpler theory where the appearance of fine-tuning just sort of disappears. And we should not judge, but because science is ongoing, physics, even fundamental physics is ongoing, it's provisional, right? But still, it's quite striking, and it's striking enough that there are many scientists trying to explain fine-tuning in other terms, right? By postulating that our universe is just one of a vast ocean of universes coming from some primordial universe-generating kind of mechanism, such that the vast majority of the universe there is no life, and now it's no longer surprising. Yeah, the probability is very low, but given that you've got 10 to the 500th power universes or whatever, it's not so surprising that at least one of them would happen to fall within the necessary range. So that very fact that people are theorizing in that way shows that they think this is serious. It's quite striking, and it's not the sort of thing that one can just idly dismiss. About such multiverse theorizing, I think it's worth pointing out that people, again, who know the science better than I do, say that it turns out that to have a multiverse picture, a picture of on which our universe emerges, along with many, many other universes, you've got to have a theory about that universe-generating mechanism, and it turns out that thing has to be described in a very fine-tuned way in order to be capable of generating even a single life-sustaining universe. So fine-tuning doesn't, it seems like it reappears at a second order. So I'm told. So I think that it's significant, and I think it's worth noting. I wouldn't want to, sort of say everything hangs on this, and that's a mistake to take what we seem to be learning from science and be deeply invested in saying it's got to be right in the final analysis. But it's quite striking, and I think it is quite powerful evidence, and it has persuaded some non-religious people to become theists, at least philosophical theists. So it's, and I guess, and what we're doing as theists is not trying to prejudge the science. We're just trying to say, look, physics isn't done yet, but it's far along the way. Basic physics, it appears to be. So it appears like fine-tuning is going to show up in the final story. If it does, right, then it's just a fact that is just accepted within the basic science. So science wouldn't have an ultimate explanation for it. And so then we're not invoking a God of the gaps, some particular part of reality that we could imagine eventually science coming along and saying, well, here's the mechanism responsible for this puzzling particular thing.
Okay, thank you. Let's try one last question. How about, and there's never a last question, is there? But for this session, what we know, we're told by others, which begs the question of authority. How do we maintain healthy structures of authority when institutions are under attack from so many angles?
Oh, my goodness. Yeah. This is a really important question, obviously, for society, for the church, for science, because science is ultimately funded by the public. So public confidence in science, this is a really important question for science itself. We need to come to terms. So
I can ask the person to reframe the question in the form of an answer. Can you see whose was that? No.
See, it's partly, I would even say to the scientists in the audience, I think sometimes it's unhelpful and not quite right to portray science as an activity that eschews authority, right? That just says we're not beholden to authority. We just, we study the world, and if the world turns out to be different from what the authorities say, well, then so much the worse for those authorities. There's some truth in that, right? But it's misleading in that science is hierarchically structured. There are all kinds of authorities, gatekeeping authorities, in the way that science proceeds and need to be in place for science. These are not infallible authorities, but they are important. Authority plays an important role in deciding what sorts of scientific hypotheses should be tested. Science funding is fiercely competitive in deciding, whether or not a bit of evidence is indicative that we need to really do a deep rethink on some area of science. Eminent authoritative figures weigh in on these questions, and it often drives where a lot of the research will go. So we need to, and that needs to be communicated to the public. When I'm talking to people about things like their skepticism about vaccination, I say, I just follow the science. I say, well, let's look at what the NIH says about this, or let's go to various other scientific bodies. We need to be humble. It's part of communal knowing, which I emphasize that in everyday life, in the church, in science. We could have a long talk about communal knowing in the church and the role of theological authority in the church, but there does have to be, we need to appreciate how important that is, because once we deny that and say, set me loose to go do experiments to try to verify what the biologists are saying, that would be a joke. I was absolutely pathetic doing experiments in college biology classes, right? So it's important for people outside their area of expertise to defer to people, which isn't to say they're certain to be right, but say our best chance of knowledge of truth is in people who are well-trained, who've looked at it, where there's communal consensus.
Great.
Not
Tim,
sure if I answered the question, but yeah.
Thank you for your work. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. Help me thank Tim O'Connor.